Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar addressing broadband in Indian country. I want to thank everybody. I know that this is a big topic in the Indian country right now with the ever-growing and increasing funding coming to tribes in order to establish broadband and to also work with other contractors in sustaining that program with additional funding hopefully coming in the future. The purpose of what we're holding these webinar series for is to hopefully educate tribes on things to watch out for. As I think we've all learned, if you work in Indian country, that when there's a large influx of funding into Indian country, there's also suddenly an onslaught of experts in the area. And so what we're trying to do is help tribes sort of navigate what they'll be maybe approached by broadband vendors, and also focusing this particular webinar on the types of contracts and alerting you to certain contract issues that you may need to be somewhat cautious and also aware of. My name is Dorothy Alther, and I am the Legal Director of California Indian Legal Services. And the presenters today, I want to thank each and every one of you for volunteering your time and expertise to this very important webinar. We have Geeks Without Frontiers and Teletech Group and BBK. Each of them will introduce themselves and a little bit about their particular organization. So I do want to let everybody know that this is a part 2 of a series on broadband, and that if you missed our first one, they're all being recorded and you can access it at CalIndian/Tribal Broadband on the CILS website. And so with that, why don't we turn it over to our presenters, and they can do a brief introduction of their expertise and the organizations that they represent. Thank you and enjoy.
Next slide, please, Mike. So I'm John Morris from Geeks Without Frontiers. I'm a director of that organization. It's an international not-for-profit, and we are focused on bringing broadband to communities with a view to improving the health, education, socioeconomic, and communications abilities of communities, or in other words, community enrichment. We work in a number of different countries, but our headquarters are in the USA. And I'd really like to thank Dorothy and Mike for this opportunity to address these really important issues about how to go about the contracting side of telecommunications. I should add that I have a number of, have some scar tissue of my own from running a telecommunications business in Europe. And I'm also a lawyer by training, so I've seen both sides of the equation.
Would you like me to go next? I'm Lisa Hanlon. Yeah. I'm the CEO and Executive Chairman of Teletech Group. Teletech, we've been in the wireless telecommunications industry for 22 years this month. And our focus has been around supply chain management. We work very closely with the telecom OEMs. We are very agnostic when it comes to helping determine what's the best solution for a company or carrier's broadband needs. We can help with everything from the supply chain to sourcing of the hardware, software type solutions, as well as, we come up with some kind of innovative solutions and to get things done. So whether it's solar type for power, drones to help facilitate things. That's what our focus has been for the last 20 plus years. And so we're looking forward to presenting with everyone today. Thank you.
And I'll go next. My name is Gail Karish, and I'm here also with a colleague of mine, Andrew McCardle. We are with the law firm Best & Krieger, or BBK, based, the largest part of our law firm and where it started is in California. It's quite large with over 200 lawyers, but in our group, we focus on telecommunications work, and we're part of the largest part of our firm works for public agencies, so local governments and other local regulators or water districts, things like that. In our group, we focus on telecommunications work. We do a lot of broadband projects, wireless, all sorts of telecommunications, and we don't represent the industry. We really help local communities get their, navigate the very complex regulatory landscape and get their projects done and their interests serve the best we can. So we're really happy to be here in this second webinar in this series and to share some of our insights on fiber and broadband project contracting. Thank you.
Next slide, please, Mike. So we thought we'd start off by addressing some big and very practical issues, and myself and Lisa, who has got lots of experience on the ground as well, will deal with some general points. As we all know, communications is incredibly important to communities, and that's why it's also equally important when planning these to look at a 10 to 20 year timescale. And that means being open-minded about the type of solution that's used, whether that includes all or part of fiber, mobile, satellite, CBRS, whatever it may be. So it's important not to look at the first opportunity that comes along and to ideally use an independent technology supplier, somebody who's not tied to particular companies or particular solutions, and to get an objective view about what's going to suit your community on a 10 to 20 year basis. And this allows for the inevitable growth of your generation and the next generation that's going to come along. And it's often the case that suppliers come along with very attractive offers to try and get you to take their particular solution. And I think that's why it's important to step back and look at the broader picture. Lisa, what's your experience with that?
Yeah, I would think, I think we have life before the pandemic and then life after the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, I don't think there was a lot of emphasis on tribal country in regards to broadband. And with the pandemic, it put a whole different highlight on the true disparagement between rural communities and tribal communities, and the true lack of broadband and how it affects so many critical things for their livelihood, from education to telehealth to so many other core requirements. So what we're seeing now, when we were working on this pre-pandemic, there weren't very many vendors, and we had to pick up the phone a lot and make a lot of phone calls to get anyone even interested. Post-pandemic, CARES funding, NTIA funding, we've seen a lot of people come out and trying to help. Some of them are very good and have the right intentions, but I would just caution that, going back to what John said, look at it objectively. Don't look at the first offer. There's a lot of, the telecommunications industries is known for people coming in, selling you a quick solution, and then you're stuck with it. So make sure you end up with a partner that is going to stick by you through the different processes, because it's not an overnight fix.
Yeah, absolutely. And I worked in Europe in the early days of telecoms, just as fiber was being introduced. And some of the decisions that were made by large corporations and indeed countries didn't really last for more than 10 to 15 years because they didn't look at what was coming down the pipeline. So I think for long-term community well-being and to some extent to address sustainability of solutions, and solutions doesn't mean networks only, it means the type of software that's used, the type of services that come with that software, and the type of solutions that can be built onto that communications. And I'm talking about, as Lisa mentioned, educational applications, health applications, remote working applications. All of these are very important for a holistic community solution for the long term. Now, an equally important part of this is the cost analysis. And really, this breaks up into two main parts. There's, as there ever is always, the initial capital expenditure cost to get the network and applications and services up and running. And often that seems like the major cost. But software itself, and typically software that has annual recurring fees, so software as a service type solutions, these are an equally important part of the equation. And a good independent contractor will look at both of these. And suppliers who offer big discounts on the initial expenditure and hope to make it back in the long term on software and services and support contracts, these have to be looked at really carefully because they can end up being a lot more expensive than something where an initial payment up front might be larger, but the ongoing payments are less. And this is an important factor for sustainability. And I'm guessing, Lisa, that you must see quite a few examples of Capex and OpEx, as we call it, affecting the long-term well-being of some projects.
Yeah, and I think a lot of funding that's out there addresses the CapEx, so initial expenditure to acquire the hardware, software, and get the actual, network and things functioning. But there is a continuous long-term fee with that. There's yearly licensing fees, yearly maintenance and support fees. So just, understand what your ongoing costs are going to be. There's a lot of ways to, you can work through that. It can be, paid for upfront for like a 2 or 3 year period, but it increases that, the costs increase with subscriber increases. So there's just a lot of little nuances to be careful of to make sure that it doesn't come back, a year or 2 years later, and the funding is no longer there to support it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Hey, Lisa and John, could we just get a definition for CapEx and just to define some of these terms that,
yes,
some of our audience might not know?
No, absolutely. Well, typically with projects, you have initial expenditure. For example, it might be putting up towers or poles, buying equipment, buying computers to support the equipment. And this initial expenditure on what you might call capital goods is generally referred to as capital expenditure. The question then becomes, how much does it cost me each year to support that, to have the staff to run it, to get service agreements for people to come in and enhance it if there are upgrades? And this operating expenditure is usually referred to as OpEx. So you've got two contrasting types of expenditure. Costs that you expect to pay in the first few months of projects being completed, and costs that you are looking at over the long term, over the 5 to 10 year period. And I think the important point Lisa is making, and I'm making too, is that these have to be looked at together. They can't be seen as separate. That brings us to single supplier solutions. And what I mean by that is that there are a number of companies, and some of them are excellent, that will offer you a complete solution to every aspect of your communications needs. And it's probable that they don't have all those skills in their own company. They'll be using subcontractors to fulfill the different aspects, whether it's software, services, support, hardware. And I think single supplier solutions obviously have their big attraction because you're dealing with one entity, you have one main contract, you have one set of people to deal with, and there's a comfort in that. And the disadvantage comes if they're not as well organized as they might be, and maybe they don't have control over their subcontractors, the specialists that they subcontract the work to. And in the long run, that lack of organization can become your direct problem, and you really want to avoid that. So single supplier solutions can be extremely useful, and they can be difficult. And I think going back to the starting point of having a good independent technology consultant who knows the industry, they should be able to make strong recommendations, as long as they're not financially incentivized by them, to identify for you the right kind of supplier for your particular requirements. Lisa, I'm guessing you'll have some experience of this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, having the single supplier solution is not necessarily always bad, but it goes back to the agreement you have with that supplier, if you do go that route, to make sure, you know, like John was saying, it doesn't come back and you're all of a sudden responsible for trying to make sure that your prime contractor, subcontractors are doing the work that they're contracted to the prime contractor. So it just, you know, goes back to your agreements and just being careful. And with everything, you know, with telecommunications growing and, you know, it's everyone's trying to upgrade their networks in so many different capacities. Anytime you can use local resources and good, reliable local resources, I would always go that route. Not only, you know, do you have someone there that you can call on, but just cost-wise, you don't want to have to bring in, you know, teams from all over the country to help you with your project. You know, using local resources, having your own internal workforce development, you know, as part of your sustainability is another good thing to have as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Skills transfer, education and training, so that you can actually manage some aspects of the networks and its maintenance yourself. I mean, that's a great point. Moving on to demand aggregation. This is, I guess, a fancy name, but what it really boils down to is that if you can combine your own demands for hardware and software and also connectivity, so the amount of internet that you think you're going to use, if you can combine that with another community or another organization, it can give you certain benefits. So on the one hand, you might be able to negotiate better terms with suppliers, whether they're hardware or software suppliers or internet capacity suppliers. And demand aggregation is very attractive to suppliers because it allows them, it gives them more economic certainty of a return on the project, which is really what allows them to give you the potential for discounts and for better long-term support, possibly at a lower cost. So that's an important point to be aware of if you have other communities or big corporations that you have good relations with, that you can have those discussions with. They're well worth having. In terms of big ones, again, this is another perhaps fancy name for the fact that there are often facilities that can be shared. So rather than, if we talk about fiber, we talk about poles or towers. If some of those already exist, so for example, the railroads, most of the railroads in America have fiber laid down along their length because they have an obvious right of way. And if you can find existing fiber from owners like the railroads who are willing to share those facilities, or towers or poles who you can also use to help to support your own network, then these can not only save significant time to market, but they can also save significant cost. And again, going back to a good neutral consultant, they should be able to help with identifying these facilities and these opportunities to share facilities. And that can work to the benefit both of the tower or pole owner and also to the owner of the fiber conduits that you might share the facilities with. And just to add to that, it's also a potential source of income for your community if you develop network resources which can subsequently be shared with other communities. You can obviously get an income from that, and that helps with long-term sustainability. And I think BBK might be talking more about that subsequently. Have you come across that much, Lisa, in your work?
I think when it comes to fiber, absolutely, there's a way to monetize that if you're investing in the infrastructure to, to actually put the fiber in yourselves. But if it goes into towers are a big business here. And if there's a need to build a tower on the land, I would recommend that you get a good design on the tower and you make it work and withstand holding additional weight and capacity, because that's another source of income. There's a lot of smaller carriers, larger carriers that are always looking for space to put up their own equipment. And if the infrastructure is already there, that's a win-win for everybody. And it's a way for you to monetize that from monthly recurring revenue.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that goes back to allow for growth. And it's not just the growth in your own community, but it's also the growth of neighboring communities, corporations, whatever it may be, who will happily part with income to use the facilities that you've developed. So that's a great part of the planning strategy. Could we go to the next slide, please, Mike? So I just wanted to run through some very more commercial side of contractual considerations. So dominant supplier contracts, I think the point here is that where you have a very big dominant supplier, there can be a tendency for them to try and force their terms onto the people that they're supplying. And I think in this context, it's very important indeed to have strong representation and strong legal analytics, if you like. And you're very fortunate in having the Californian Indian Legal Services to go to as a first port of call. And I think it's very important indeed to do that before signing a contract, however attractive the terms may be. A critical, and please anybody else jump in on these, Lisa, especially because I know you'll see the cutting edge of all this. And that's in the world of supply and demand. This is where we meet the reality of these things. Deliverables, hardware, software services. I mean, that's the whole world in itself, really. Specifying the right quality, the right quantity, the support for them in the short term, the setup, the training, the installation, timelines. All these things are very important indeed, because they all represent possible problems in the project, and a good legal advice and good commercial overview can help to iron out these things. And that makes for a less expensive, smoother project, which is hard to achieve in these complex communication deals. Similarly with service level agreements, it's very important indeed to make sure that your supplier is positioned correctly through the agreement that you make with them to support you in the event of outages, problems, upgrades, disasters. So that could be weather, it could be fire, it could be anything. What does your service level agreement assure you in the event of these issues with from your supplier's point of view? What responsibilities do they have? So they're very important indeed to get you know, a strong service level agreement. We mentioned subcontractors before in the context of a single supplier, but when you enter into an agreement for hardware, software, or services, it's very important to understand whether the company that you're contracting with is actually going to use subcontractors to deliver what they've agreed to deliver to you or not. And if they are, do you have any control over the quality of that subcontractor? And is that subcontractor liable to you in the event that there are issues? And again, these are contractual things which are immensely practical in the everyday world, because a bad subcontractor is bad news for any project, and very important in the legal world to try and pin down right at the onset so that you're actually more in control of what's happening rather than less in control. Insurance is really, again, a very practical business. You need to make sure that your suppliers have the correct insurance for the work that they're doing for you to cover things like personal injury, faulty goods, negligent work, meaning work of poor quality, systems that don't work when they should, that kind of thing. And you yourselves will need to carry insurance in the event that suppliers are injured whilst doing this work on your grounds, if in some way or other you or your staff or your community are negligent in relation to the suppliers. So insurance is very important, and it's often not thought of until something goes wrong. And I've seen many examples of that over the years, where companies, some of them quite big, don't think that insurance is important, and then suddenly there's a very material issue and they're having to fund the payments out of their own pockets. Similarly, the other side of insurance, if you like, is indemnities. So with your suppliers, you need them to indemnify you against certain issues that come up. And that could be breach of confidentiality about the project. It could be stealing ideas that you have developed, which they take away and use themselves, your intellectual property. It could be against faulty workmanship, and so on. And similarly, they will expect indemnities from you for similar reasons. So in the event that you steal their intellectual property, or if you like, their ideas, or you recreate some of the software that they've made. I mean, these are normal things where people want to protect, companies and individuals want to protect themselves against other companies and individuals stealing what they see as the core value of parts of their business. Changes to contractual terms, finally. I've seen so many cases where parties have verbally agreed to do something. It's never been written down, never been signed. And then suddenly when there's a problem, everybody conveniently forgets what's been agreed. So it's incredibly important, however well one knows a supplier, however friendly they are, to write things down and get it get it signed, and then everybody knows exactly where they stand, especially if staffing of a project changes and new people have no idea at all what's been agreed. So again, that addresses sustainability, certainty, cost, and so on.
And
so I think
John,
I've probably, yeah.
John, I would just add on the changes to contractual terms, even not necessarily a change, but what I commonly see is where the kind of discussions of the project go on and sort of promises are made in talking about the project. And then the agreement comes along and it doesn't line up with what you kind of had in your sales pitch. Yes. Partly because there will be a lot more, outs or exceptions or qualifications on things that sounded really good in the PowerPoint presentation of this is what we're going to do for you. And the devil is really in the details of seeing that the contract that is offered lines up with the expectations that have been set in the sales presentations.
Yeah, no, absolutely, no. And there's so many examples of this. And sometimes it's very hard to insist on getting things written down and agreed because it goes against the grain of relationships and so on. But in the long run, it's far better for everybody because there's certainty on every level. Anyway, I think I've probably, we've covered the general situation enough. I'm going to hand over to BBK to go through some more detailed contractual things. These are really important, and contracts, a well drafted, well considered contract in the long run is a core part of the success of any project.
Thank you, John and Lisa. And if you can go to the next slide, please, Mike. We're going to turn now and sort of drill down on some of the typical agreements that you might see in a broadband project. And certainly they're not all going to come in with these names necessarily. There may be combinations of elements of these different types of agreements show up in a single agreement. It may be a little bit, one of your first challenges when you get a contract, maybe just to kind of sort out, well, what promises, what is this covering? What promises are being made here? Is this a complete project agreement? Is this just one component of what we need? I'm going to go through these briefly with my colleague, Andrew McCardle. He's going to touch on some of them. I'm going to touch on some of them, and I welcome comments and input from everyone else on the panel. We just chose some of the bigger topics, the bigger agreements, and highlight some of the issues that come up and things to watch for, but we could spend a whole presentation on any one of these agreements and get into the weeds on them. So if you can move to the next slide, please, we'll start running through them.
Yeah, if I could just ask one thing when we go on, I think a lot of the audience and tribes that I've worked with, a lot of the capability of doing this broadband expansion is coming from, recent grant funding and expected grant funding. And, people come and kind of present, a package to a tribe. And so I think it'd be helpful for the audience to kind of get a little bit of a sense of how the industry is changing and maybe expectations in these contracts, and to know, I don't want to lose this opportunity if I push back and say, I want to have more control over your subcontractors, or, I want to have you indemnify me if these things happen. And so I think a little bit of context about how risky engaging that is, or the expectation being, you often get a bad contract first, but if you push back a little, it's quite capable of, we see a lot of really good contracts after some negotiation. So anyway, I think the audience would appreciate any insight you have on that.
Sure. And it's a great point. So oftentimes, and I find this especially in the context of working with a lot of local governments, that they're not, the staff are not that familiar with the industry, what to expect from contracting. And a lot of times the contract is sort of presented as, well, this is our standard contract, almost like there is no room to negotiate. Everything, by and large, is negotiable in these contracts. There will be some limitations on what terms a particular company is willing to modify, but there is no, this is not where they're offering you a service that is under some approved tariff or something like that, that they have to go to the Public Utilities Commission or something on. these are unregulated by and large areas. There's some exceptions, but the contracting is really a matter of just negotiation and what are common sort of industry terms. You will not have a company come and offer you a contract that is more favorable to you than to them. That's not in their interest. So if you're presented with a contract, know that it's always going to err on the side of benefiting the company that brought it to you first. And it's kind of your job to see that it works for you as well, and to ask for changes where needed to achieve that. And these are the projects and the development is a high priority. The money is there for these projects by and large through the funding opportunities. So people are not going to just walk away if you say you need time to review the contract, consult your lawyer, read it closely, make sure it works for you, and propose terms that may be counter to the first offer. So I wouldn't shy away from ever doing that. I don't think I've ever encountered a contract that I've been asked to review that we were unable to make changes. So you should bear that in mind, that it's perfectly acceptable to be asking for these kind of changes that suit you. So if that answers that general sort of question, Mike, then I'll turn now and start going through some of the individual contracts. Great. Okay. So, and again, there's nothing magic about the names. These are just sort of general areas, and they may come into you with different names, but we're focused here mostly on the contracts, with some exceptions, mostly on the kinds of contracts you might see when you're involved in the construction of a network, as opposed to just purchasing some services where the provider is going to deal with how they're going to get to you to provide the service. So if you're constructing a network, obviously there are going to be some form of construction contracts. And those are contracts that detail the labor, materials, the costs, the methods for constructing the fiber network, or if you're putting in a tower or other telecom infrastructure. And what we find, some of the things to really watch for in best practices is pay a lot of attention, and this point has sort of been made already with the earlier presenters, but pay attention to the scope of work and the procedure for change orders. You have to have a clear vision of what you expect to get, the network that will be constructed, and how you're going, whether if it's clearly defined and thoughtfully defined up front, there won't be the need for many change orders. But if you do along the way determine that you need changes, that's going to have an impact on the cost of the project. And so the better you can define sort of how the scope of work and what you're looking for up front, the better you'll be able to control the costs and keep them within what your expectations were when you signed the construction contract. Another important aspect is really with respect to the performance metrics. So you're going to want to have a schedule of performance, not just, usually, not just you're going to build this network and it's sort of open-ended when it's going to happen. So you'll want to have a schedule, probably with milestones, so you can check in on progress. You're going to be concerned about the qualifications of personnel and subcontractors, the use of subcontractors. Who are the subcontractors that will be used, and to ensure that they're qualified. A payment schedule. I would be very leery of a payment proposed to be paid all up front before anything got built. So you may want to tie the payment schedule to the milestones and performance of the construction contract. All of this is to ensure that you have a quality build a timely build. And another piece on construction contracts that can be really important to pay attention to is the acceptance process. So you've procured a network, it's been constructed, but how do you know that it's been done right without some sort of an acceptance process where maybe there's some tests that have to be done to verify that it's all operating properly and working, certain inspections, and also warranties. How long are they promising that it will work at that performance level, that initial performance level? And how do you get protection for if you run into any problems with the performance of the network? All of that is geared towards ensuring that you get what you expected. So that's construction contracts. They're also in this sort of overall kind of project vein. You may have something called an operator agreement or something similar to that. And that's an agreement with a third party to operate the network that's been constructed. And there, again, some of the key things that we see time and time again that are worth really focusing on: the scope of work of the operator. What are they responsible for doing? What fees are you going to be paying them for doing that? And what oversight do you have over their performance? And you want to make sure that they are incentivized through the scope, the fees, and performance metrics to ensure that they meet your goals, not their goals for the network, but your goals for the operation of the network. So that's where we're spending quite a bit of time on in negotiating these agreements. Another is the customer relationships. Who owns the customer? Whose customer is it? That can be a tricky question if you assume you own the network and you have a third party operating it for you, and having the direct customer relationship, the kind of face-to-face relationship. So yeah, it's really important to make sure that it's clear and to set the terms and privacy protections that you think are important if necessary, if they are having the customer relationship, but you want to ensure that they treat customers fairly and you have some say on how that is done. Another is you may have contracted with an operator and you potentially may not be satisfied with their work, or you may want to bring that work in-house and run the operation yourself, but you need some time at the beginning to kind of learn how to operate the network and get your own team up to speed. So there, I would say it's really important to think about a transition plan. If the contract ends, if it's terminated for default because they're not performing well, or just because you have a plan to take over, it's really important that you require the cooperation of the existing operator in that transition to the new operator, whoever it is. And the best time to really talk about those issues are when you're negotiating the agreement, because once the agreement is done, and if it's silent on these, it can be a very messy sort of unwinding and transfer without some sort of commitment to cooperate and share information. So those are just a couple of highlights of best practices for a couple of the agreements. So if we could go to the next slide, I'm going to turn things over to Andrew, and he's going to talk about a couple of other types of agreements.
Great, thank you, Gail. Yeah, just one general point, kind of building on your response to Mike's question, I did want to note that, I've been more and more we're negotiating with the carriers on various agreements, and I will say that, like Gail said, of course you can, negotiate. There's a lot of room for negotiation, but don't be surprised when the carriers act as though there is not room, or they potentially become, a bit aggressive in trying to push their form on you and all of their terms on you, and acting as though it's a take it or leave it scenario. And you know, obviously it just depends on the specific agreement, but just don't be thrown by them taking an aggressive stance, because I think they sometimes find success that way, and it's important to push back when you can and when you need to. So yeah, the next type of deal document here, we have a fiber or conduit lease. So remember, fiber goes into the conduit. So you could have a couple different things going on, but generally it's a type of lease agreement, and you're setting all the terms and conditions, including the payment or consideration required for using existing conduit or fiber. So it could be that you have empty conduit in the ground and a carrier wants to go ahead and put fiber in there to bolster or provide their services. It could also be that you have fiber that's not being used, sometimes called dark fiber, and a carrier comes along and wants to use it. Some of the important best practices here, starting with consideration, it can be cash consideration, you know, strictly monetary, like a rent. It could also be combination of that along with an in-kind benefit. So an example there could be, hey, we'll let the carrier put their fiber into your conduit, but you reserve some use for your services to provide some benefit to the tribe. And you can, be creative in the way that you're structuring those to really maximize the benefits that you can get, because you may be able to get a little bit more on the in-kind side than the monetary side. It just really depends. So you want to explore your options fully there to try to get as much as you can. In these agreements, you also want to clearly define, the available assets and what rights you are conveying. At the very least, you want to have a depiction of, basically the overall infrastructure that's available, and then what portions of that the lessee is able to use. But it can also be really helpful to have an additional, word description, so that it's not just generally saying the conduit and then they're filling all of it when maybe they don't need it, or you don't want to give them that much given the rent or in-kind benefits you're getting. And then also just be clear on the access front. Who can access the fiber or conduit? When can they do it? How do they do it? Do they have to provide notice? It could be during certain hours of the day. You also want to address emergency access. If something happens, something's gone wrong, you don't want to be in a position where you can't handle an emergency because you're not under the agreement allowed to access that area or access the fiber or conduit. And hopefully nothing would happen, but these are all just things to think out in your efforts to protect the network security and integrity. Another type of deal document here is called indefeasible rights of use, or an IRU. In a way, it's similar. It's different. So it's an alternative to the leases that we were discussing. And in an IRU, your parties effectively purchasing use of network, fiber, conduit for a set number of years. Could be 10, 20, 30 years. They are generally, longer, 20, 30 years than shorter, but it's a set number of years, and you're often paying up front. So rather than leasing on a monthly basis, annual basis, you're just purchasing it for a set amount of time. The best practices have some overlap because it is often dealing with a similar type of infrastructure. Again, you want to just define clearly the routes and facilities that are allowed to be used. That's going to help prevent any interference or issues or disputes upon installation, but also in the future if other projects are occurring in the same conduit or in the same area. Having those clearly defined routes now is going to really benefit all the parties involved. And then also you want to address both routine and non-routine maintenance. If we're looking at a 20 or 30 year time span, a lot can go on, and the cost can be high, especially if it's some sort of unusual or non-frequent events, such as a relocation, or there's some sort of major maintenance or repair that needs to occur. You want to address that in the agreement so it's clear if there's cost sharing or who is paying for what, who's responsible for actually performing the work or obtaining someone to perform the work. So those are just some of the important considerations in these agreements that'll just alleviate headaches or problems in the future. And if you can go to the next slide, Gail is going to talk about a few more deal documents.
Sure, thanks, Andrew. So another agreement, and this has been discussed already a little bit, the service level agreement. So those agreements are really one you'd have with a service provider that sets sort of the minimum standards and performance metrics for the service that they're going to deliver. And there in the broadband context, if say you have it can come up, say with an operator that they're going to operate the network at a certain level of performance, and that means that you expect it to be, you know, on all the time, and that if there's a problem, they jump on and make repairs, things like that. So one of the key things, other than setting what is the standard that you expect itself, is how do you enforce that standard? And so that's where you spend quite a bit of time in these sorts of service level agreements, looking at what is an appropriate response time and a repair time for problems. So it's important to set something that's realistic. If you're located in a remote area where it's going to take a while for the text to get out there, you know, it might be that you have a response time that is longer than, say, when you're close to a larger urban area. And that raises another point of it's important to know who's going to be performing these service levels and where their staff are located, excuse me, because what you might have on paper and what could really be done might be quite different. So when you're looking at it, set realistic but meaningful standards and put some teeth in the performance promises. And there, the things may be, you know, be careful about things that say, you know, that are sort of open-ended in terms of time, where it says, you know, some sort of effort to, you know, commercially reasonable effort to try to get there in 4 hours or something might be a little bit too vague to really hold their feet to the fire to perform. And you may want to have credits if they can't perform. So if you expect the network to be up for, you know, 95% of the time or 99% of the time or whatever it is, and they're not meeting those requirements, then you should be getting some sort of credit for that because you didn't get the product that you expected. So those are some of the issues that come up in service level agreements. Another category that seems pretty esoteric, but is kind of a critical part of rolling out a network is pole attachment agreements. And that is if you're stringing fiber above ground, then you're stringing it on some sort of poles and utility poles typically. And so the agreements, pole attachment agreements, are agreements that set the terms for attaching fiber to existing poles. It could also involve attaching antennas to existing poles. So the first issue that comes up and that's really important is who has the right to use the pole and who's exercising that right. If you're the network owner and you are hiring someone to construct the network, or do you have the agreements in place to ensure that your network can go on that pole? Another important aspect, in some areas, and depending on the provider and the poles, these rates actually may be regulated in some way by the California Public Utilities Commission or the FCC rules or others. So I didn't put pole attachment rates down as a best practice because that's not something that typically has a lot of negotiation, but the record keeping and audits is super important to be able to verify pole counts, what poles are being used, are you being charged accurately, or if you own the poles, are you charging, do you know who's on those poles, and are you verifying that the pole counts and the accuracy of the charges that are being assessed. So those are two more types of agreements related to construction and installation fiber broadband networks. And I'm going to turn it back to Andrew to talk about 2 more. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Gail. So I believe these are our last 2 deal documents. First being site leases. So these are quite a big one, come up pretty frequently, but this is an agreement to install telecom equipment on another party's property. Could be, you know, building some sort of structure on a piece of land. Could already be a tower there and you're putting something on it, or it could be on a building rooftop or facade. There are many options. And one of the big issues that comes up is clearly defining the site as well as access and utility routes. And similar to what we were talking about, some of the, you know, the fiber or conduit leases, this is going to help avoid future conflicts. You want to be very clear about the area that's actually being, because that has an impact on the rent and the use of the land. And this could include, there's been instances where, just for the record, if it's a tower, and let's say there are branches or fronds or something coming off of it, you also want to clearly define what aerial space those can take up. So that's kind of a specific one, depending on the installation type, but it's something that goes along with defining the site. And also the access and utility routes. How are those, you know, even though it could be a wireless facility, for example, it does have to have power and it has to have a network being fed to it and some fiber being run to the tower potentially. So how are those getting to the actual installation? That's another thing that needs to be addressed. And then another big issue would be subleases and assignments. You know, are others allowed to use the site? Let's say the other part, you know, the third part, the other party is lessee is putting up a tower. And they're going to have some equipment on that tower. They may want to lease space out on there to make additional money. And the owner of the property may want to have revenue sharing or some sort of related provisions built into the lease so that they also obtain money from future installations on that tower. And then, you know, site leases are another instance where the indemnification and insurance provisions that John was talking about earlier are important, especially if you have these large constructions going on a building or even just on a tower, a big tower is getting installed. And then the other type of deal document here, co-location and access agreements. So generally there are agreements where a party's trying to, again, put telecom equipment in a facility that's already supporting or housing telecom equipment or in or at a building that a company wants to serve. So some best practices here, you want to clearly establish the operating requirements, making sure the facility is going to meet all the equipment needs. And also, again, as you've seen a few times now, I think, just clearly defining access to the area or facility, who can access them, and it's all about protecting network security as well as likely, you know, the security of the property and who can be there and when and who has access to it. So those are the last 2 types of deal documents. If you want to jump to the next slide, we can start to wrap up a bit and probably take next steps.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of information, but all of it really important, and kind of where practical stuff meets legal and commercial requirements and really needs to be dealt with in that way. So just by way of wrapping up, I'd say a really key thing is to use an independent consultant who are not tied to a particular technology or a particular supplier, simply to work out what the best long-term cost-effective solution is for your community's needs. I would say that's probably a great starting place, and you know, Dorothy and Mike are in a great position to help you with that one, even though they're principally on the legal side. So, and the next point, I think that's you, Lisa, is it?
Yeah, just you know, just be cautious on who you kind of partner with and who you bring in. It's important to understand. You know, we've had a couple instances working with a few of the tribes, and it didn't have tribal council support. So, you know, just be cognizant of the fact that, you know, you need to have it from not just the IT side, but from, you know, the entire kind of council to support it. So you don't hit the roadblocks that we kept hitting to get the actual project complete.
And I'll maybe make a last comment just on the conclusions here. We talked about a number of different types of contracts. And of course, it's important to define the contract terms and conditions in a way that will serve your ultimate goals. So, you know, you can get kind of buried in the weeds of these different types of contracts and what you're negotiating on it, but it's good to step back and have a kind of clear understanding of what your priorities are at the end of the day, or your objectives in terms of maintaining your sovereignty may have an impact on what you decide to do about ownership. Socioeconomic objectives like jobs, health, education, water management, those may have an impact on what you decide you need in your service level agreement or in your operator agreement, about customer relationships, about the availability of the service, or even the price that you might pay. And so there's one level is kind of the weeds of negotiating the contract, but the other is to always kind of have a clear North Star of what's your ultimate objective here with this contract and this project, and to make sure that you are able to fulfill it through getting the contract terms that you need. Thank you. I think Dorothy may have something to say.
Oh, I just want to say thank you to all of our presenters. This was extremely helpful information, and I'm hoping we can continue to maybe delve into these contracts, maybe in a third presentation. For all those who are participants on this, are attendees on this, again, I just want to let you know that this is being recorded so that you know, you can come back and review it or share it with your tribal council or whoever is going to be making these tough decisions. And I would just like to reiterate kind of what Lisa was saying, is that I just know from our experience that oftentimes we are working with the consultant, and the tribal the consultant and the tribe's EDC, Economic Development Corporation, and sometimes we kind of lose track of the fact that, you know, it is the tribe, the sovereign tribe, who will be making some of these decisions. So just make sure that everyone is sort of in the loop moving forward with these types of projects. So with that, I want to thank everybody again for your time and volunteering to do this. So thank you again.
Thanks,
it's been
everyone.
a pleasure. Thank you, Dorothy and Mike and everybody.
Bye.